good people live good lives. Of the myriad of things that you could do in terms of career or interests or hobbies or whatever, as long as you lead with justice, and justice in the context of like doing good, moral good, ethical values, if you use those things as your baseline, as your foundation, then all of the other stuff will sort of fall into place. If you treat people kindly, if you hold doors, if you engage in honest, open conversations and you tell the truth, you will get opportunities, you will get education, you will get financial success, you'll get all the things that are required of living and leading a good life.
Welcome to the Doing the Work podcast. I am excited for this guest, Joel Sherman, who's been on the show before, and I've been on his show as well. And we always have such amazing, deep, full conversations. And I've got some exciting stuff to ask you about today. So welcome to the show, Joel.
Thanks for having me, man. I was going to ask you, have you ever had repeat guests on your show before?
No, you're the only one.
There you go. So you're actually the most reoccurring guest on Good People. So I intend to hopefully maintain that position.
Yeah, well,
on your show.
like I said, I think we keep doing this because we have great conversations, and which means it's a treat for everyone listening right now.
Well, let's hope so.
No pressure. So yeah, I've got some things that I want to ask you about. There's some like big, exciting things going on in your life that I wanted to dig into a little bit. I know you're about to get married in a few weeks.
That's right. Yep. And I think it's 24
days, less than a month. And, you know, I was on a show maybe a year or more ago, and he was actually a dating expert. And I was actually kind of like the host of him, and I was supposed to be asking him a bunch of questions, but obviously while I'm asking him questions, I'm learning a lot. And one of the things that he said in there just like struck me super hard. And I'm gonna butcher this and paraphrase it, but what it really came down to was, you know, picking your partner and who you marry is the most important decision in your entire life. It will determine how much success you have in life. It will determine your level of joy, you know, your financial situation, and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I kind of agree in a certain sense, but I would say that the success of your relationship, I think, is actually not super dependent on the person that you decide to be in a relationship with certain parameters, obviously. So here's a good example. One of my favorite qualities about my fiance is that she is like, nothing really bothers her in a certain sense, and she's not a very jealous person. And so what I mean by that is I'm not a super flirtatious guy, but like there's no worry in her mind about anything that I'm doing or anything that I have going on. And I've dated girls in the past that was like a big part of the way that they operated in a relationship. And part of that too is like I was very young. I was in high school and early in college. So I think there's a level of maturity that comes with it. But so like there are certain traits like that, right, that do matter, that add up over time if there's an annoyance, right? But I think that a lot of the success of a relationship, it is both people, but it really comes down to you and how you handle situations and your ability to talk through them. And I guess at like a foundational level, I think one of the most pertinent characteristics of a successful, happy relationship is honesty. And that obviously goes into like the whole communication is key thing. But like if you're just honest with somebody about what you're thinking, about what you're feeling, about the things that you've been through, it's a lot easier to have difficult conversations about things that pop up later on as it relates to things you're working on together. So for example, my fiance and I, we just got a puppy, right? As you would expect, there are certain challenges that come along with that, like getting up in the middle of the night to let the dog out. You know, like how you train the dog. This probably is even the tenfold of that when you have like actual human children. But it's not that big of a deal to us because it's easy for us to have a conversation. Like if she's doing something or if I'm doing something that is counterintuitive to the goal we're trying to accomplish, which is like a well-behaved, well-trained dog, it's easy for us to be like, hey, I think when you did this, we should probably try to do this instead. And we don't like disagree or bicker or argue over that. It's just like, okay, yeah, good point. You know, let's move on type thing. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but I don't know if it's necessarily like the right person. I do think that there are probably certain levels of compatibility that matter, But the thing that really comes down to it is being honest and also being self-aware enough to make the changes that you need to provide for whatever your partner needs at a given time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you know, I think you're saying that because the person who you're choosing to get married to is meeting you with that equal, you know, responsibility, you know, and obligation. I think sometimes you would know it if you didn't choose the right person, because you know, whatever you're bringing to the table may you know, may not be met with the same you know, energy. But I'm curious, as you're 24 days away from your marriage, is there anything that you guys have done as a couple, I guess more formally, to prepare for this life together? Some people do marriage counseling or educational classes and things of that sort. Anything like that?
So actually, sort of, but I would say nothing officially in regards to like the quality of the marriage or specifically about marriage. And the reason why is, so her and I both majored in communications in college. She did PR and I did interpersonal. I actually took a bunch of classes on romantic relationships, but I feel like that the aspect about our relationship when it comes to romance and like communication and providing for each other as like a romantic partner has been very easy. It's been very natural. And on the other end of that, to answer your question, I think the most obvious thing that we did in the recent like 3 months or so is we started working with a financial advisor. And that has basically been a version of couples therapy, because, you know, like when you start working with a financial advisor, at least this has been my experience, this is the only one I've ever worked with, you know, you basically fill out this huge questionnaires, not only about like your financial situation and what your plans are, but like what are your long-term goals. And when we sat down with her together on the first meeting, and she was like, what is it that you guys want to accomplish in the next 10 years that we need to talk about as it relates to finances? Things like travel, things like expenses as it relates to, like, for example, I know you and I we enjoy shooting. I plan on purchasing firearms, ammunition, engaging in marksmanship as a hobby and activity. Like, those are all important things that you should talk about, right? Because we're going to be spending money on this. And when you become married, for the most part, your assets become one. I know there's a big thing where people aren't doing that. I actually am kind of against that from a big idea perspective. I think like the joining of everything is one of the things that makes marriages so special. And I think that if you leave anything outside of the bounds of marriage, it's going to be a cause of tension at some point. But in a lot of ways, working through that whole process, you know, learning the process of how we're going to join bank accounts and do all this basic stuff and how we're going to plan for our retirement and seeing all the numbers broken down and like what we need to do in order to accomplish that has given me a good perspective on a lot of things about our marriage, because it's, number one, it's highlighted that we have a lot of the same goals, like having kids and like at what age we want to buy a house, all these things, right? And so it's kind of given me excitement in that way. But it's also shown me where I might need to step it up a little bit as it relates to like job or financial situation, so that, I don't know, there's just a higher commitment level now to where I want to prioritize for the sake of our relationship, if that makes sense. So I would say nothing in regards to like the emotional sort of therapeutic sense. I feel like at least now we have that sort of like in a really healthy place. Not to say that if you're in a healthy place you shouldn't pursue those things, but it's naturally easier for us where some of this other stuff like financial planning and things that give us both headaches have kind of served that same purpose.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, you know, money is one of the biggest stressors in a relationship. You know, I guess by research or by data, that would be something you would find commonly. So jumping right into that arena probably would highlight a lot of this for your future, whether it was intended or not. But you know, when you did it.
Yeah, it ties into the first point too, because like, to be completely honest with you, money's obvious. I know money's important, but like I just don't put I don't really care about it. Like, it's something that I know will be a product of the work and the effort that I put in. And if I continue to pursue the things that I'm interested in, I will probably be rewarded in that way, right? Because I'll be good at the things I'm interested in, and I'll naturally gravitate towards the higher levels of those things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Callie comes from a family and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but like financial security is something that's
Yeah.
extremely important to her. And I've known that, but when we met with the financial advisor and it was like blaringly obvious to me as we were talking about it, it has made me want to recommit to this as a thing, not for the sake of getting more money or whatever, but providing security and emotional and, you know, ensuring a level of happiness and joy about our lives together because it's something that she wants and not necessarily something that I
Yeah,
care as much about. Does that
completely.
make
I
sense?
think, taking money out of it specifically, but if there's something that you're aware of that's extremely important to your partner and you're committed to that relationship, you want to come to that, and help provide that for them so that, it's a give and take, because there's going to be something also that you really care about that maybe she doesn't really, but she's also going to give the same energy and effort in that relationship because she cares and loves about you and wants you to be fulfilled in that area, or not have that worry, at least.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You said that, it highlighted where you might need to step up or do some different, change your plans a little bit about your future. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so I think like most people, we've talked a little bit about education, the education system, college, things like that. I believe on my show, I know we've talked a lot about it, just in, conversations that we've had in private as well. But I think like a lot of people, I think I saw a statistic, 52% of people who have college educations don't actually use their degree for the field that they get involved with, right? I'm one of those people. I'm very fortunate. I don't have a lot of student loan debt. Callie doesn't have any student loan debt, so that's obviously great too. But even still, I got a major in communications. Like I said, it was concentration in interpersonal, so I worked a lot with like how to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody, interviewing, family relationships, romantic relationships, things like that. I'm super pro college experience, but I think the amount you pay and the education that you get out of it or the credentials you get out of it don't always pay off necessarily, at least nowadays. But I'm saying all this because I took that degree and I transitioned into a career in fitness, and I'm the head coach, general manager, these kind of arbitrary titles that we give of a CrossFit gym in the town that I live in, and I absolutely love the work that I do. I'll be a fitness coach my entire life in some capacity, but I guess this kind of also ties in the podcast too. So I started my podcast in March of 2023, and it came out of a time when I had basically a scheduling void to fill. As you know, when it comes to getting a career started in fitness, it takes a while to build up enough clientele to where you can have a sort of consistent schedule. You're sort of all over the place, early mornings, late nights when you start, and it takes a while to get a good block out of the day to where you can just like train back to back for several hours, right? And during that time, I had a pretty big gaps to fill in my day, and I had actually started a podcast in 2019 when I was in college. It was called the Invent Podcast. It was also a self-improvement podcast. It was with my roommate at the time. We did a couple episodes back and forth. They were not very good. I think you can still find them on Spotify somewhere, which is actually interesting. Like if you compare my recent show to that one, like the difference in quality and my ability to do it is crazy. But I started the show because I had this scheduling gap and I wanted to basically do something that would not only improve myself, but it would allow me to explore some of these other areas outside of fitness as it relates to self-improvement, like mental, emotional, financial well-being, all these things, right? That I wasn't really able to explore. Like I didn't really have a curiosity outlet for these things. And I never went into it with the intention of like being able to turn it into a career, but it was always a thought that I had. Like I would love one day if I could grow this show to the point where it could provide for me financially and I could continue to do some combination of what I'm doing in a more sort of like balanced and less scheduled, jam-packed type way. And so, fast forward, it's been like a year and a half. We actually just took a indefinite hiatus from the show. My producer is having a baby in October
Awesome.
as well. And I'm obviously getting married. But there was a bunch of stuff that kind of led up to it. Like I'm sure we'll get into this in a more in-depth way, but to give you kind of like the 30,000 foot view, the last 6 months, I sort of woke up one day with this feeling that a lot of the stuff that I wasn't doing, that I was doing rather, it wasn't meaningless, but it was less meaningful. It was less, it wasn't making as big of a difference as I felt like I could have been making. And a lot of this was this mounting pressure that I was adding on myself to like be not necessarily set financially. Like I don't really care as much about that, but I want to ensure that I'm taking steps that will not be the cost of a potential family in the future, right? And I'm not like a all-in plan A only type of guy. I'm always like a plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then take whichever one's the best option. And so the podcast was that. It was like plan E, right? And it kind of got to the point where it was just taking too much time away from my ability to, I basically felt like out of all the things that I was doing, I wasn't able to do any of it very well because I was just pulled in a bunch of different directions, right? Like relationships that I was trying to build, not just romantically, but with my friends, a career that I was like, not necessarily floundering, but I was just kind of wading water with fitness. Like for the last year and a half, I've kind of just stuck where I was at. And I was putting a lot of pressure and I was getting a lot of stress from the fact that the podcast was no longer scratching the curiosity itch that it once did when I began it. And so because of that, there's just been this long process of like, okay, what can I do? Like, how can I honor the curiosity and the interests that I have now, but how can I also set us up so that we at least have like a backup plan or whatever for the future. I sort of have known over the last 5 years of working in fitness that I don't really want to be a gym owner, at least not yet. And I feel like that is a path that could lead me to the sort of financial security that I was alluding to earlier. But it's just not something that I feel like I want to do or that I'm necessarily made to do. And through a number of other events and things that have kind of popped up, there was an opportunity that was not presented to me necessarily, but was shown to me by a friend of mine who I actually had on the podcast who was in the Navy and all this other stuff. Just basically joining the National Guard. They have this Special Forces unit. You and I have talked extensively about this because you're in the National Guard. And that would seem like a really awesome route. But like current plan is kind of putting the podcast on pause, getting married in the next 24 days. And then it'll probably take a while just because things do with the military. But at the beginning of the year, I'm going to join the National Guard and as an officer, and then pursue a degree, education, some kind of credentials in like IT, development, technology type stuff. Just because I've always liked computers. I built my first computer when I was like 12. I've always been on computers. I've always liked the technology. Like when we do the podcast, all the audio stuff has been like super interesting and fascinating to me from like a technological hardware software level. And so I just want to explore that a little bit more. It's just sort of a shifting of focus so that I can make sure that, worst case scenario, in 2 years, I have a security clearance and another degree in a field that I could transition to and make pretty decent money while I pursue these other like quote unquote passion projects that I have going on.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I always tell people that, there are a lot of things that you can do really well to a high level, but that doesn't mean that they're the right things. In the Army, we call these MOPS and MOs, measures of performance versus measures of effectiveness. So measures of performance means you can do something 100% right, doing things right. And then measures of effectiveness is doing the right things. And that's two very different paths. And we've all probably heard, people say you really can only do 2 to 3 things to a really high level. And so you've got to make some decisions. Really successful people make those hard decisions. It's like, yeah, I really love doing this, but it might not be the thing I should be doing. And it sounds like you've kind of, that's kind of the path. That's what you're trying to figure out for yourself.
Yeah, well, at least right now, like, it's funny, some of the sort of personal conversations that I've had about this. 2 years ago, if you told me that my dad and I were similar, I would have been like, no, we're not. Like, we're not similar at all. Other than like, he raised me with similar values. Like, my dad is a great man, by the way. I don't want it to sound like he's not. But kind of going through this, I've obviously talked with my parents and things about that, but it's made me realize in a lot of ways how similar I am to my dad and his dad, even, who I also wasn't super close with growing up. But my dad's like me in a lot of ways, where I have like 7,000 interests that I would love to pursue. And there's just no, I know, and I've internalized, there's just no way that I'm going to pursue them. And the other side to that is, because of that, because of the amount of interest that I have, there's really nothing that I love a lot. You know what I mean? Like, I just really like a lot of different things. And so it's been challenging to sort of pick a path and go down it. One thing that I will say that I think I do a good job regardless of that is, once I've decided on something, I'm pretty good at committing to it for an extended period of time, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, right? To see the thing through. And I know my podcast, we went about a year and a half. I don't necessarily feel like I made it, quote unquote, but I figured out how to do a podcast, and I figured out how to do one pretty well. At least a product that I was relatively proud of. And, I went down that path and I saw what it was like, and I would love to revisit that path because dude, I love having these conversations. Like, anytime anybody asks me to be on a podcast, I'm going to say yes, just because sitting here, talking into the microphone, sharing ideas, sharing things that I've been thinking about, it's awesome. I love being able to do it. But it was just another iteration of the funny thing about me is, whenever I do something, it's like, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Like, that's seriously my mindset. I thought that with the podcast. I thought that with everything that I've ever done, right? I solved Rubik's Cubes when I was in middle school. I thought I was going to break a Rubik's Cube speed record, right? But even me committing that hard to something, I'm never really afraid to, like, all right, let's move this this passion thing to something else, right? And something I've realized through this is that even though I have all of these interests and I don't, quote unquote, love anything in particular, what I love is being passionate about stuff, and I love working hard, and I love being disciplined, and I love committing myself to something. And so even if I, change gears every 5 or 6 years for my entire life, I know that I'll be able to achieve a certain level of competence in a thing. And that in itself, to me, is fulfilling enough.
Learning how to learn is a skill in its own. And that's what I'm hearing you say. And I can identify with a lot of what you've already shared, because I was like you. What I know about you from knowing you for about a year and a half is you're a seeker. You are someone who is out there pursuing, something bigger than yourself, and really out there doing the work to dig and find and excavate meaning and purpose and value, and and so like you, it took me I pivoted and changed and started things and stopped things a lot until I was like in my 30s, until eventually you seek long enough and you find all those things that you kind of put in your bag as skills and understandings and learning. It's an education that eventually you land on something that you're like, oh, this is it. And when it's not. Like you right now where you're sitting, know that you haven't found the thing, but you will know it when you do find it. And that's just the path you're on.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, I think that a lot of people discount, right? Like, I think if you put this decision on a piece of paper, and then you also took like all of the other things that like my resume, right? I've run a 100-mile race. I'm a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for like 4 years. Like all of these other things. Like I am not incapable of doing like a tough thing, or like, I mean, I went 6 months of like being a little uncertain about whether or not I wanted to continue doing the show. And I just like kept thinking that if I continued, I would sort of break through this weird emotional plateau. And it just never subsided, and it kept building and building to the point where I was like, you know what? I think this is the right decision to make. So with all of that, I think a lot of people sort of go through a process like I did, and it's really easy to convince yourself that you like quit, or you gave up on a dream or whatever. But I mean, a year and a half ago, I couldn't say a sentence without a shit ton of filler words, without a bunch of dead language and dead phrases that I didn't even really think about what they meant. They're just part of the way that we speak and communicate with each other. I by no means was nearly as confident in speaking on a point or thinking about a concept on my own without the influence of somebody else telling me what to think or feel, right? And so all of that time, however you want to chalk it up, if I quit or whatever, you can't discount that education that you were referring to, where I am an amazing speaker compared to how I used to be. It's affected everything in my life. Like I communicate better when I'm talking to people, when I'm training them. I communicate to people better when I'm having a conversation with a loved one. I give more forethought to the ways that I interact with other people. I have more empathy about people's point of view. I can consider things more thoroughly. And all of this is a product of me deciding to record on a camera and have a conversation with somebody that I didn't know, talking and learning from them about something that I hadn't yet learned about. And it's been an amazing journey so far from that. And I imagine, like I said, I don't think it's going to be over yet now. It's just sort of like on pause, right? And I don't know what that's going to look like, but I would imagine that I will revisit this form of conversing at some point in the future.
I've had the extreme pleasure of actually getting to see the majority of your journey on your podcast. I met you. I think you were like episode 4 or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you were early on.
And you're right. It is a marked difference in who you are, how you speak. I mean, your energy, how you carry yourself is. You're still you. You were you then. It's not like you're like a completely different person, but there is something different about you because of the podcast, and or maybe not just I mean, there was other things going on in your life, obviously, but I saw the evolution as your podcasts were going on, and so it's kind of a cool thing to see. And truthfully, for me, as someone who has a podcast, I have not done my podcast nearly as successfully as you did in that year and a half for lots of reasons. But I always, I start mine and I stop it and I come back because I miss what I get, what I learn and what I get out of it and how it does change me. I always come back to it. So, you're right. You may come back to yours, but I do want to go all the way back, if you can remember, to, starting Good People, your podcast. Can you remember what it was that what was it that you originally were hoping to get out of it? Other than like a career, maybe you would get some financial gain or something. There's dreams of stuff like that, but the original conception of the idea, what was that for you?
Yeah. So I worked closely with my producer on the show. His name was Cayman, or his name is Cayman.
He's still with us.
He's still alive. But so he's a full-time videographer, photographer, now works for a pretty successful golfing YouTube channel. But he's a member at the gym that I coach at, and a couple years older than me. I knew he did photo video work. It's always just kind of been an interest of mine to some degree, like not necessarily doing it myself, but I don't know. I've always revered the creative people that can do that kind of thing pretty highly. Like it's a pretty damn cool field of work to be involved with. And he was kind of in a similar situation that I alluded to earlier, where he's done freelance work, I think, since the beginning of his business. And he had schedule gaps that he wanted to fill. There was something that he wanted to tackle on. He had a couple of opportunities presented to him. And we were actually joking in the gym one day when we were squatting, because he was wearing these pair of Gymshark shorts and I was wearing the same pair. And we were like, yeah, man, these are the only shorts that I can wear that like fit my waist. I have a 32-inch waist, but also fit my ass, because all the other pants that I wear are like either too tight on the leg or too loose on the waist. And I joked to them, I was like, dude, we should start this like small company called Big Ass Shorts, where we design a short made for people that have bodies like you and I. And we kind of laughed about it. But then like 2 or 3 weeks later, I was like, hey man, I don't know if we should call it Big Ass Shorts, but would you want to sort of follow through with this thing and see what it would be like if we were to sort of launch a product? And he was like, yeah, sure, whatever. So we get together, we come up with a bunch of names. We actually settled on Red Shorts was the name of or Red, and it stood for relentlessly endure discomfort. And we wanted to make like an all-in-one short, something like casual that looked good if you were to wear it to brunch or play golf. But you could work out in, you could like jump in the swimming pool and all the things, right? And so we followed it. I mean, dude, we had great ideas. We came up with these like we called them invisible belt loops. It was just like elastic tight to the pants, so you couldn't see them, but you could put a belt through them. If anybody's listening to the show, I think my agreement with the company that we talked to is expired now, so I think you can take that idea. But in any case, like we followed it all the way through, 8-inch inseam. Everything was how we wanted it to, and we got down to the wire. We wanted to do everything made in America, ethically sourced. It would have been like a $40,000 to $50,000 investment, which was money we didn't have. And so we were kind of posed with this question, like, should we try to like build a brand and sort of go into it knowing that we can be at least break even, or should we like take the risk and try to do this thing right now? And we were both kind of like, I don't know if I'm really that passionate about shorts. You know, it just didn't seem like a smart idea. And from that, I was like, well, we had developed those shorts for like 4 to 6 months, dude. It was a long process of like coming up with mock-ups and all these things. And it was like we clearly work well together because we've had these consistent meetings. We've held each other accountable. Like we do a good job. I would like to pursue a podcast potentially. It's something that I've always wanted to do. Like I said, I had one in college. And the video editing and the post-production stuff was the biggest hang up for me. I could not bear that type of work. And I was like, you can fill the void that I hate, and I'll be like the front man. I'll interview people. And he was like, yeah, cool, whatever. We went through the whole process of getting things up and running. And in that process, it was kind of this idea of like, okay, what are we going to call the podcast? And we had both agreed we want to do this sort of self-improvement thing. I didn't just want to talk to people about fitness and like, you know, mindset and these sort of arbitrary, subjective things that we all get to experience. I wanted a little bit of that, but I also wanted to learn from researchers and from people who have data that backs up certain things that I'm interested in. And I mean, the things that I'm interested in is this huge pool of things, right? Like I've talked to people about anger. I've talked to people about child development, how social media impacts child development, some of the problems that we have in our society about why we are in this sort of like educational like system thing that you and I have talked about before, all the things, right? And then it just became this thing of like, what are we going to call the damn thing? We couldn't think of names. We came up with so many. I used ChatGPT, everything. And I remember typing in ChatGPT, come up with podcast names for me that are similar to good people. Like I literally typed that in, and it came up with like 15 that were just not it. And then I was like, why don't I just call the show Good People? And I sent it to Cayman. He's like, that's it. Like, this is what we're calling it. It was like the only sort of like epiphany moment that I've ever had in my life that actually like panned out. And I mean, everything was intentional at the beginning, man. Like when we started, the logo of the show, it's actually AI generated, but it's a guy in a hoodie that's facing away from the camera. You can literally just see this sweatshirt, this gray sweatshirt with him wearing a hoodie, and it says Good People in this very simple, bold font. And we wanted from the beginning the show to be about the people that we had on and the conversations that were taking place. And I mean, if you look at all the top podcasts, it's probably not a very good strategy. Like all of them have their face, the host's face on it with like the words around it and these like bright colors. But it was like gray hoodie, you know, anonymous person on the cover of the show. And it was just all for that. It was like we started it, I think, with really good values, and we went into it with the intention of trying to accomplish this thing, which I think we did a pretty good job of. And that's kind of it. You know, I sort of came to the conclusion of what good people meant to me probably 6 months into the show. And it was just a very simple realization that I realized that good people live good lives. And, you know, of the myriad of things that you could do in terms of career or interests or hobbies or whatever, as long as you lead with justice, and justice in the context of like doing good, moral good, ethical values, right? If you use those things as your baseline, as your foundation, then all of the other stuff will sort of fall into place, right? Like if you treat people kindly, if you hold doors for people, if you engage in honest, open conversations and you tell the truth, you will get opportunities, you will get education, you will get financial success, you'll get all the things that are required of living and leading a good life. And I realized talking to people about, I would talk to somebody, a researcher, about anger, and then I would talk to my friend Jason about riding 500 miles through Spain unsupported by anybody, and like we were talking about the same things fundamentally, and it was just it's a really clear explanation to me that like a lot of the shit that we do in life it's kind of secondary to the fact that you just should be a
Yeah.
good person.
And, is that, I mean, if you went through the whole thing to like where you're sitting at now, is that basically, okay, so I guess assuming, let's pretend that your podcast was like your PhD program and you are now sitting here with your like doctoral thesis. Is that kind of where you've landed? Is that this is, I guess tell me more about like where is it that you've landed now, having done 70 episodes of your show?
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than that in a lot of ways, right? Like the surface level is what I said, good people live good lives, right? But what does that mean, right? I think in a lot of context, that's super contextual, right? You have to look at the person. Everybody's different. Everybody's lived through different experiences. Everybody has different interests. Everybody has different aptitudes. And so it would be hard, I think, for me to say more in that regard, right? Like you just have to kind of look at the person. Everybody, I think, can relate to the fact that your priorities change. We've talked a lot about that, I guess, on the show, right? Like I'm getting married. We started working with this financial planner. I want to make this, subtle career shift thing, right? But I'm only able to analyze that because I'm currently going through it, right? Like 5 years ago, I needed something different. I needed a podcast. I needed a structured career that required me to like grind a little bit to get clients, right? Because when it comes to my like development, if we could call it that, those were the skills and things that I needed to acquire at the time. So I think that's one of the cool things about the way that is so broad and universal, is that what it speaks to, good people live good lives, as it relates to self-development, is that it is just truly about self-development, right? Like what would a good person do right now? I think it was the right thing for me to do, to put the show aside in the last couple weeks so that I could focus on the success of my family and the commitment that I'm making in my marriage, right? Like that's
Yeah.
the right thing to do. And some might say that I've like quit or whatever, but I'm only acting in a lot of ways. I was joking with somebody earlier, like doing the show made me quit the show, because I kind of got to a place, this is a better way to put it. I kind of got to a place where the show was taking so much of my time that I could either do the things that I was saying that you should be doing while I was on the show, or I could continue talking about doing the things. And it didn't feel like the right thing to do for me to talk about doing the things and not actually do the
No, I
things, if
love
that
that.
makes
And I
sense.
think that that's a place that I came to at some point in my life also. I was reading all the book. Essentially, this is my story. Not saying that it's your story, but this is my story. I didn't feel good enough. I didn't feel like I knew enough. I didn't feel expert enough, or, just I didn't feel enough, right? And so I went through all these things and experiences trying to feel like I was smart enough or educated enough or wise enough. And so I was reading all these books, and I stayed in school and grad school way longer than I ever should have, and so on and so forth. And yeah, at some point you just realize that you have to just get out there and do it. And I just finished Right Thing Right Now by Ryan Holiday. I don't know if you've read that, but he
I've read the first part and I put it on pause to read a book for my book club, and I'm
yeah,
about to resume. I
yeah,
already love it so
exactly.
far.
And really what I love about all of his work, but about that book in particular, is that it's just all these great examples of people who did good things, who were good people who did good things, and how they did it. And they weren't, I don't know anything about their lives, but the fact is there was action behind what they were doing. It's the book was about justice and doing the right thing for others, bigger than just being about yourself.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, as it relates to justice, and again, I might just be kind of repeating what you had just said about like sort of committing yourself to the action. I think it's kind of obvious to most of us what the right thing to do is. It's like, if you've ever opened up to somebody about trauma, every inch of your being does not want to tell them the things that you went through. But then you do it and you feel better and you realize that this person still loves you, even though you did what you thought was like these egregious, like horrible acts or whatever, whatever you went through, whatever you shared. But the right thing to do was to be honest, right? And if you don't, Jordan Peterson has this really great concept. I learned about it from a guy on my show named David Millar, and I looked into it a little bit more. Jordan Peterson said in his clinical practice, and by the way, I understand Jordan Peterson's a bit of a controversial figure, but this is a valid point. He said in his political practice, he's never seen anybody get away with anything ever, right? And I've always felt that intuitively. I didn't use that language, but like, for example, if I continue down this path that I'm on, and in 10 years, it still hasn't panned out yet, but I sort of grunted my way through it. I was doing the work. It was improving. I was developing myself, but I didn't have much to show for it in regards to financial security, or like I wasn't around for my kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That is a product of a decision that I potentially committed myself to 10 years ago, right? And so on a big scale, that's what that would look like. But even on a small scale, things like if you throw something at the trash and it bounces off and hits the floor, like and you don't go pick it up, lots of iterations of that sort of allude to the type of character that you have. You will not get away with those things, right? And so that's why it's important to do the right thing. It's because when you die, it doesn't matter all of the stuff that you necessarily went through. It matters about like this pile of character that you've been able to build up. And if you are somebody who doesn't act in accordance to the good things that we all know that we should, it will catch up to you in some way. And it's going to look different for everybody, but it will catch up to you in some way. And whether you want to do good out of the accordance of self-preservation, I think we should all strive to do good for the sake of doing good. I think that usually good things happen to people who try to do the right thing.
Yeah, and to your point, how you do anything is how you do everything. So the example of throwing a piece of paper at the wastebasket, missing, and just letting it sit there, yes, in and of itself, it's a very innocuous, harmless thing. But when given the opportunity in a bigger, more meaningful event, you might also do the same thing, and that's really how it catches up to you.
Yeah.
Well, I really love what you're saying, because so I have a future person coming on the podcast who he's a dad expert. He's a father expert, and really what, as I'm researching for that episode, he, really what it comes down to is like you make a decision to be a good man. And when you are a good man, then you're automatically a good husband, and you're a good father, and you're good at your job and everything else. But that first decision is just like, I'm just going to be a good person, and it kind of carries over to everything else.
Yeah. I think that is like such a obvious and like intuitive thing that everybody understands. And something that I still struggle with, and maybe you have an opinion on this, is I don't understand why it's so hard for people to commit to that. Like I really enjoyed the podcast, but I think I don't want to look back on this decision and say like, oh, that's the reason I got divorced. It's because I didn't do that one thing, and it's an easy decision. Like that's an easy decision. My relationship in my family and the joy and fulfillment that will bring me, it trumps everything else. And that I probably won't have kids for like 6 to 10 years. And I know that to be true. And that's it. I've understood that, and I want to make sure that I'm not doing anything that will prohibit me from being able to relish in that that joy, that purpose, that fulfillment, that I know that the most important thing to me is that, and I want to ensure that to the best of my ability I
Yeah,
can do it.
well, I think everything you said is accurate except for one thing. I don't think that everybody gets that. I don't. Yeah,
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. Like, why is that such a hard thing for people to
yeah,
realize? I don't
exactly.
know.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that really is what it comes down to. And the problem is that there are some people who have some success in some domains of life by being the opposite of a good person. And depending on what you kind of look at and admire about a person might lead you to make decisions like they did that would also affect your ability to be a good person. And then how you're brought up and what you're, there's a lot of contextual and environmental and social aspects that I think impact that. Well, diving into kind of your experience of the podcast as I've gotten a good idea of like kind of what you learned and what some of the outcome, what was the impetus and what's been the outcome. What about the process of the podcast and maybe like what it was like to get ready for guests, or like what maybe some of the most impactful moments were, or the product isn't in my opinion nearly as important as the process, because like that's exactly all those things that you got out of it were because of the process. So I'm kind of curious about it.
Yeah. So this, I think, was broken down into two phases through the kind of the journey. And this is actually something that I take a lot of pride in regards to the work that we did is, so there was basically two phases, and I don't remember exactly when the first one ended, but when we started the show, Cayman lives like 10 minutes from my house. So I would drive over and we set up like the first set that we had was I was sitting on a leather couch, the famous leather couch. And by famous, I mean like 10 people who were watching the show at the beginning of it. But I was sitting on a leather couch in his office, and we like broke his office down when we were in there. We would like pull the couch out from the wall, and we'd set up our key lighting out in front, and then we would do our like two supporting lights from the side, and then I'd have a little hair light that was sitting behind me that would make my head.
Is that how
come
that
off of the
happened?
black
I
wall,
always
right?
wondered why that looked so good. You had some. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and now it looks like shit. No, just kidding. But so I was like sitting on the couch. It was like total studio, like budgeted studio. Cayman had all the gear already, so it wasn't really that big of an expense for him. But it was like camera was 5-10 yards away from me. He was sitting at his desk, which was right next to the camera, and he was like on the computer and would give me feedback. He was viewing all of the audio stuff while it was going on. He was, watching to see how the connection was to make sure that we didn't lose anything. If there was ever a hiccup or somebody needed to adjust their camera, he was there to sort of guide people through that I think we had an issue with one of your shows, and he like popped on the mic and was like, started talking to you a bit. It was something along those lines, right? I think it was like 8 to 9 months into the show. It was close to the first year mark. And he accepted this position as this, as the videographer for this golfing YouTube channel. And they might still be doing it. One of their goals, I think, for this year was to do play a game of golf on every continent. And so his first trip that he took with this group of people was to Dubai. And he was going to be gone for like 2 weeks. I think he actually ended up going to Australia a little bit later on too. But anyways, it became this like scheduling nightmare, because what we had done is when we started recording, we just recorded on Wednesdays. I basically like took off of Wednesdays except for really early mornings and really late evenings at the gym. And I would give people a 9 to 5 open schedule when I would interview them, and they would just like book the time, and then we would do it whenever they signed up, right? And so we did like 3 weeks in advance before we actually launched the show. And then we always had 2, 3, I think even at one time we had like 4 or 5 episodes up in the bank. But that became really problematic because Cayman was going to be gone for 2 weeks, and then he'd be back for 3, and then he'd be gone for 4. And it was like, okay, clearly we're going to run out of episodes. So we tried to double book. We tried all these things. And it sort of came to this idea where I was like, hey man, I'm like invested into this thing at this point. Let's just, I'll pay the money. We'll invest in a setup to get at my house, which is what you're seeing right now. It's a very similar setup. I have like my camera mounted to my desk. When I did my show, I wasn't sitting in a chair, but it's 7 p.m. for me and I'm tired, so I wanted to sit down having this conversation. But yeah, it's like very similar lighting. It's just the background is a little bit different. Um, so in regards to like the actual, sort of setup of everything, it hasn't changed a lot. It just shifted at one point from Cayman doing pretty much everything back end to me doing some of the setup stuff, in regards to the actual shooting. And then he's obviously handled all the post-production stuff. Like we have a Google file. I don't do anything. He just uploads the videos and the clips, and then I write all the copy and post it and that sort of thing. In terms of my like actual prep, again, this is what I think I would say I pride myself the most in. Because of the variety of guests that we had on and trying to book people who are like researchers that I guess aren't really well known, there was a couple of like research journals that I would typically check out as they publish on a week-to-week basis. There's like the Journal of Social Communication. There's like a couples and relationship journal. There a bunch like sociology, evolutionary psychology, etc. These are commonly updated and revised research articles. And so I basically just had this like big long email that I would send to people who are researchers of like, this is how I found your work. I would love to interview you, whatever, right? I would say even later on in the show, I would get one yes for every 10 to 15 emails that I sent. So, I mean, it was like a lot of work, man. Like I would sometimes spend 3 or 4 hours at my computer finding people who seemed like they would be a good candidate for the academia is hard because there's a lot of narcissism and there's also a lot of like awkwardness, which I think comes out in a couple of the shows. But every once in a while you get somebody that was willing to share, and most of the time it was great. But once somebody committed to coming on the show and I booked them, even when I was doing it at Cayman's house or I was doing it at mine, I would probably spend 2 to 3 or 4 hours per episode just like reading some of their work and coming up with a thorough list of 15 to 25 questions in a topic list that I could send them beforehand. Just because, like I said, with academia, sometimes these people, they're really great at research and they're super smart and they read a lot, but they're not great at talking. And there's definitely people that I had on that I would only ask 4 of the 25 questions that I prepped because they were very good at speaking and they just sort of carried a conversation. But there was other times when, man, I'd get through all 25 questions in like 25 minutes. And then it was like, oh, and you kind of have to spitball and expand on a couple of things with like charisma and that sort of thing. But yeah, man, I did a lot of prep work. The most thorough thing that I did was I interviewed a guy. He wasn't the guy who wrote the book, but he was a guy who worked closely with the guy who wrote the book on marriage. And I like read 3 or 4 research articles. I read an entire book that had come out. It was like 3 weeks of consistent prep for this one episode. But I don't know. For me, I'm definitely better at sort of spitballing and being charismatic and talking openly about things. Like, I think even me sitting here as we're talking, I'm reflecting on the last time that you had me on the show, and I don't know if I did a bad job, but I definitely didn't do a great job, and I feel like more confident about what I'm able to do now, right? But it was the same with interviewing. I needed to do a lot of prep work. And I would like drive to the gym and I would like pretend to be having these conversations with people on the way there. Like this is just my character, and probably one of the reasons why it became so overwhelming is like I would commit for a long time, usually a week of like practicing and prep work for a specific episode just so that I could get it done and be happy with the product.
Makes a lot of sense now. Like hearing how much work and preparation that you've put into your craft and where it's come, it makes a lot of sense now why you evolved, I guess everything became so much more polished. After I had you on an episode, it was an educational panel with some other guests. Every single guest that was on the show messaged me and like, who is this Joel Sherman guy? Like he's honestly, I mean like, and I'm not like just like blowing smoke up your ass. Like they literally texted me and was like, that guy was so well spoken. He stole the show. I felt like, and they felt like they didn't do nearly as good of a job. But like you said, if you go back to your older episodes, there's a major change. And I guess it's fortuitous that you're on a show called Doing the Work, because that's what it took to get this good. It took an investment of time and mental capacity and want to get to this state of where you're at now.
Yeah, I would say this too. I can't remember exactly everybody, but there was just a handful of guests that I had on that reached out afterwards. And the one that I'm remembering, and it happened a couple times, I remember, but was Adrian Bosman, who was, I guess he didn't direct the programming of the games this past year, but was the director of the CrossFit Games programming at the time, and had taken over for Dave Castro, and I interviewed him, and we were pressed for time, and I was not happy with the outcome of that episode because I try to kind of rush through things. But he had said, he was like, hey man, like the prep that you did was awesome. Like he's like, I've been on a bunch of podcasts, and that's probably the most thorough prep work that I've seen from anybody. And I remember him saying that. Obviously it was a nice compliment, and I thanked him for that. But even afterwards, not only did I take a lot of pride in that as a compliment, but I was surprised. I was like, really? Like, you're like, you deserve that kind of prep, man. Like, you are at the top of something, right? Like, it surprised me that more people didn't, I guess, commit to that type of prep work. But from the beginning, like, that was sort of the mindset that I had, right? Like, if I'm going to do this thing, I want to try to do it the best way and the right way to do it. And just like Cayman works so hard on, like, dude, he was just as anal with the camera light stuff as I was with the way that I was communicating and things like that. Because I remember we had an episode where the angle of one of the lights was just not quite right, and he apologized to me like 6 or 7 times. He was like, dude, I'm sorry. Like, I'll make sure I fix it. I'm like, dude, this is not a big deal to me, right? But that's just kind of the way that we were, and I think that's one of the reasons why, number one, we worked well together, but there was this evolution of the quality of the show over time.
And I guess this is a great time for me to plug, if you had not heard of Good People podcast before, now is a good time to get caught up, because he's taken a little bit of a break. But the quality, you'll see what he's talking about. The quality and the attention to detail, and just the overall product is fantastic. I mean, I don't actually listen to that many podcasts anymore, but I watched all yours because I know you and I like you a lot, but also because it's just such a good product.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that, man.
Of course. Well, as we wrap up, I'd love to, now we kind of know where you've been over the past year and a half or so. We know you're going to get married in 24 days. We know you're looking to join the military. And you're kind of like taking some, looking at some career changes. Anything else that you're kind of looking forward to coming up in the future?
I've actually been thinking quite a bit about this idea. Are you rushed for time, by the way?
I know it's late for you.
No.
Yeah.
No, I'm good, man. My bedtime's not for another hour until 8:30, so we're all good. The reason why I say that is just because I think I'm actually interested to hear your opinion on this. I've never had a 5-year plan or a whatever. I've never had that. And I think in a small way, the break from the podcast is sort of me reclaiming that quality about myself. You actually shared the Japanese concept, the Ikigai, with me. We were meeting for like a virtual coffee one time. And this was like, I think probably 4 months into that like 6-month process that I was talking to you about like me trying to make this decision. Kind of came at the right time, because the Ikigai, by the way, super impactful on my life in the last couple months. It's broken up into 4 categories. Just to give a brief overview, if anybody listening hasn't checked it out, I think it's totally worthwhile to check it out. It is what you're good at, what you can be paid for, what the world needs, and what you love. And when you share that with me, I actually like went through the process of writing all of these things out. And by the way, there's like this whole intersection of what these things mean and like how you should sort of use this to frame your life. But what I realized was I was doing things that I could be paid for, and I was doing things that I was good at. And I mean, I guess you could make the argument that I was doing things that like the world needed, right? Like I was engaging in honest conversation and talking about improving yourself, right? but there was no room in my life for anything that I loved. Like by no means was I floundering in my relationship. I feel like I've always done a good job at like trying to maintain and nurture and grow this thing because it's important. But outside of that, like I I pretty much have stopped jujitsu. I go to jujitsu like once a week now. And in the last year and a half, I've really only gone once a week, right? And that was from like 3 or 4 or 5 days a week. And I love jujitsu. But a lot of these things that I've loved have taken a back seat. And so it's no surprise that I woke up one day and I felt like a lot of the stuff that I was doing was meaningless to a certain degree because there was no room for certain qualities and things that I enjoyed to do that had no purpose other than what I loved. The cool thing about Ikigai is it translates to the reason for being. And I think if you asked me before, like what the purpose of life is, it would have been to like do meaningful work or like be useful, right? That's like a commonly held sort of neo-masculine view nowadays. And reflecting on the idea of Ikigai made me realize that that's not true necessarily. Like that's a part of it. You have to do what the world needs. You have to be useful. You have to commit to a kind of work, right? That is going to make a difference. But there's also a piece of it that is, what do you love to do? Like I love playing video games. I once played video games to my detriment, my health and my friendships and all these other things. But like, I've started playing video games again a little bit, right? In a healthy way, in a way that is just enough that it sort of reignites my inspiration to pursue the other aspects that I have in my life in a better, more excited and vigorous way. And so to answer your question, I know this is long-winded, I apologize, is that a piece of that was this I'm sort of an erratic decision-making, like not afraid to just shift gears completely. I've done that my whole life. Like I said, I was going to be a world record Rubik's Cube solver. I was going to be a magician at one point. I was going to be a professional League of Legends player, an esports athlete. I was going to try to compete in jiu-jitsu. I was going to run ultra marathons and be a motivational speaker. I was going to be a podcast host, right? All of these things. And anything that I've ever done, I've sort of committed to it. Like this was going to be the thing that I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And then when something else comes along or something becomes stale and is no longer able to serve me in the way that it was, I'll shift gears and it's not a problem. In the podcast, it didn't necessarily put constraints on that, but what it did was it made me this like goal-oriented person, right? Where it's like, okay, I want to make it to this episode, or I put pressure on myself to achieve X with the podcast, not necessarily like views or whatever. But I've realized in deciding to kind of pull back for a second, one of the things that makes me is that sort of like, I'm going to just join the National Guard and like get a degree in IT, which has nothing to do with anything that I've got going on now, but it just sounds interesting and I'm really curious about it and I want to explore that, right? And the product of that hopefully is this like security that we were talking about earlier, right? But I felt like I couldn't do that for a long time. And now I feel like I can do that again. And I imagine that I'll probably try to continue to keep that aspect about myself, right? I think another way to put it in like a storybook sense, in this kind of language that I've been using, is there's these kind of like warrior type people, right? Like the David Gogginses, the Jocko Willings, the ultra marathon people. I was trying for such a long time to be like the warrior, right? Because all of my interests sort of fell in line with that. But I am not really that kind of guy. Like, I joke about it a lot, but like my ultimate goal is to be a wizard when I die. Like I want to be the old, crazy, like wrinkled, big beard guy that smokes out of a pipe and like says wise shit and then just like laughs and runs off. Like that's the kind of guy that I want to be. And there's a sort of like, eccentricity. I don't even know if that's a word. Eccentricity to that, right? And for a long time I felt like I didn't have that, and now that I do. So to answer your question about what my plans are in the future, like I don't know, and I don't want to know, because I think it's kind of silly to assume that we know where we're going to be, and that to me is exciting. To answer your question, I don't care how I get there, but I know that I want to have a family, and I mean like that's pretty much it, right?
Well,
So
I think this is a good time in your life for that. And I actually commend you for that, for kind of realizing, having these realizations right now where you are in your life. I can't remember how old you are, but you're young. Um, 24.
I'm
Yeah,
24.
I was going to say older because you seem so much older, but that's really my point, is that so many people come to the realizations that you're having right now when they're 40. You know, when you hear the term midlife crisis, and that's kind of a real thing because people realize that they spent the last 20 or more years chasing meaningless and unfulfilling things, and it all kind of comes crashing down on them because um, you can't time leap. So many people live in the future or they live in the past, and they forget that their whole life is happening right now and in this moment. And I think it's just a really wise and um, insightful realization that you're coming to it right now, is that, like, I'm not gonna get so wrapped up in what's coming in the future. I'm gonna do the things that I love right now, and I'm a big believer, and I try to live this way myself, is that when you're doing what you love and you're being a good person, to the point of what we talked about earlier, everything else falls in line for you. The money comes, the family life comes, the whatever it is, and I think that's the Ikigai concept, which I fell in love with also. I have to thank my podcast producer for putting me onto that, because it changed so much of the way that I was thinking. And I just love that that's what you're kind of experiencing right now, and that what you're, where you're at on it.
yeah, when I was like in the trenches with this like emotional stuff, Callie said to me, she said, it was when I was still like just initially exploring the National Guard stuff. And she was asking me like, why do I want to do this? Just like getting clarification, like, why do I want to do this? What's the reasoning? And I was like, I think this will be a path that will put me towards the language I used was, this is going to keep me on the path of being happy or something like that. And she looked at me and she said, don't take this the wrong way. I don't think that you're ever going to be happy. And like, we kind of laughed about it, and she didn't mean it necessarily in the context that you might be thinking when you hear that. It was more so the context of like, it is just my nature to project into the future, like you had just mentioned. Like, this will be better, right? And yeah, that is going to be awesome when we get there, but it should not be at the cost of the things that we're going on right now. Like, I will only be unmarried for the next 24 days. Like, this is an unrepeatable time in my life, right? And we just went on this past weekend. We had like a little book club meetup, and like 2 months ago or a month ago, we went on a week-long vacation, just us. Then we went out to dinner this past weekend, and I've found myself in the last couple months, like, this is the last vacation we're going to take before we get married. This is the last time we're going to go out to dinner, to a nice restaurant before we get married, right? And it's all been in an effort to do what you're talking about, like appreciating the unrepeatable nature about the things that we're dealing with right now, because they're going to be gone. And my nature is to change and be erratic and do this or do that thing. And those things are going to be just as awesome as my life is right now when I get there. And so there's no rush for me to get there, right? Like, it's just the cliche aspect of presence and mindfulness and all the things that go with that, right? Like, it's super important, I think, to be able to realize that those things will come, and it's not a big deal, and don't rush yourself to get there, right? Because what you have now is special in its own right, and you should be focused on that.
Well, I have to make one comment. I can't end the show in any better way than kind of what you just said, but I do have one comment before we wrap it up. Is you had said something about warriors, and that maybe that's not who you are. You're more of a wizard. And you mentioned, Goggins and Jocko and a couple other people. And I have to say that you would be surprised at how many warriors are just like you. They're somewhat of wizards, and they're not what you think they are. Some of these ones that rise to public notoriety they aren't the majority by any stretch of the imagination. Some of the nerdiest, most intelligent, and unsuspecting, amazing warriors that I've ever met were very similar to you. So I just really appreciate who you are, man, and how you show up in this world and what you've taught me just from the conversations that we've had through your podcast, just through our friendship. So just so much gratitude for you. And this was an amazing episode that I know that everyone who gets to this point is going to be so glad that they listened to this episode. So just thank you so much, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for saying all that, and thanks for having me on, man. I always love doing this, and I know we say this all the time, but we don't get the opportunity to chat enough. So let's try to stay in better touch.
Yeah, we've got another virtual coffee date coming our way.
Yeah. For anybody listening, that is such like a clutch thing to do with people that aren't close to you in vicinity is FaceTime with a coffee, talk for 30 minutes to an hour. Every time we do that, I feel good for like a whole month afterwards.
Same. So yeah, we've got to do it again. So, okay, man. Well, have a great evening. Thanks to everybody for listening. This is Joel Sherman, and we're signing off.